Also, skipping this step will make you come off like a gold star jerk. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, immediately on the thoughts and prayers phrase as her first reaction to the Christchurch mosque shooting a few weeks ago, before awkwardly amending it after people noticed how callous it was. It's not that she was necessarily wrong to express this frustration with some people who use the phrase, but seemed to completely skip the part where she recognized that a lot of people were very upset, and this kind of thing is sad and traumatizing, especially when it's live streamed. Because even though there is absolutely a thing called compassion fatigue, and if we tried to emotionally process all of these frequent tragedies, our hearts would explode like viscera-filled water balloons, it's still good to remember that there are people very closely connected to these events. People who, as we're now learning about in terrible ways, will continue to feel the loss of their loved ones while the rest of us are yelling about politics. So yeah, little thoughts and prayers can't hurt, you monsters. That said, it can't be the only thing we do, something I'll get to not right now. First, I want to talk about the next common reaction, refusing to share the killer's name, face, or beliefs. Much like thoughts and prayers, this is a well-intentioned good idea under certain conditions. The theory behind it is that if we make the killers famous, then they are getting exactly what they want, and it will therefore inspire more people to go on killing sprees for notoriety. Along with making logical sense, there's actually some science and studies backing this up as well. A Stanford sociologist named Mark Granovetter wrote a paper in the 70s theorizing that everything from riots to workers' strikes to elections have a sort of snowball effect, whereas everyone has a specific level of susceptibility and will cross certain moral thresholds when they see others around them crossing it as well. It's how we get copycat killers, or that Drake meme where people got out of their moving cars. It can also be innocuous, like how when one person decides to leave a party, others will use that as an excuse to also leave, finally. Except instead of going home and watching Game of Thrones with your dog, I'm talking about shooting people. We can see this snowball effect in action, both statistically and anecdotally. For example, the Pulse nightclub and Christchurch mosque shooters named previous spree killers as inspiration. And another less obvious example has to do with how the media treats stories of suicide, something that a lot of prevention groups regard similarly to a contagion. This is why the media has specific guidelines about how to report on the subject, being careful not to glorify the act or use certain photographs or share exact details of how it was carried out. And we have examples of this actually helping, such as when Vienna, Austria saw an epidemic of subway suicides in the 80s, and the Austrian Association for Suicide Prevention launched a campaign for the media to downplay the coverage. The result was a measurable decrease in suicides in a matter of years. I think we can all agree that a little media discretion is absolutely worth having less people jumping in front of trains. Even if you're some kind of soulless vampire, this still makes sense from an infrastructural standpoint. So it seems like those don't show their face or say their name people are onto something. Except nothing I just mentioned has anything to do with names or faces, but rather specific details and tone of coverage. In other words, just because you aren't technically saying the spree shooter's name doesn't mean you aren't glorifying him or adding to a larger pattern. Highlighting details like the body count, or mapping out what route the killer took, or showing pictures of the guns or the victims' crying families are all ways that could potentially inspire the next trigger-happy dickhead. So while it is important to discuss firearm regulations after recent shooting, ideas like this, they probably aren't helping, and are very bad ideas. There's a sociologist by the name of Zeynep Tufekci who actually proposed a rough guideline the media and law enforcement could follow when covering these spree killings, such as refusing to release the manner in which the killing was carried out, and working with social media platforms to pull the killer's accounts. It's a very good guideline, and yes, also notes that it would be helpful not to release the killer's name immediately after the shooting. What it doesn't say, however, is that we should ignore the motivations of the killer or the larger political and social implications of his actions. And that's where we get to that third type of reaction, which is the immediate need to discuss and analyze the shooting. And of course, talk about gun safety and regulation, which I'm not going to get into in this video, because holy cow, it's complicated. And also, probably only useful if we're going to make drastic changes to the law, which again, is complicated, but also complicated spree shootings in general. There are multiple studies showing that while the occurrences have probably increased, we aren't sure how dramatic that increase actually is. Some people have theorized that spree killings have replaced the waning frenzy of serial killers from the 70s and 80s, a claim based on very loose statistics, but kind of feels right. There are certainly is one big similarity between serial killers and spree shooters that make them both extremely hard to talk about, which is that they are both very broad crimes that we associate with a very specific kind of person. What I mean by that is, despite movies and TV making most serial killers out to be creepy agents of chaos, a study from Radford University looking at 3,000 cases from the 1900s to present found that a huge portion of serial killers were motivated mainly by financial gain, as opposed to weird sex reasons or Son of Sam delusions. Even one of the most notorious killers, H.H. Holmes, was killing people in his Home Alone castle because of the life insurance money. The cheap bowler hat weirdo even sold some of the bodies to medical schools. Also, what medical school was buying random corpses from strangers like it was scrap gold? Is that like the thing we used to do? Is that a thing we can still do? My point is that, like serial killings, spree shootings are just a genre of crime, like robbery or arson. It can be motivated by many different things. We can have discussions about the logistical ways to cut down on the general problem, the same way technology and cultural changes have decreased serial killers. But it's always worth analyzing and discussing the individual cases as well, because sometimes the motivations and individuals behind these events are going to be very important to know about and keep track of, because some of the motivations are terrorism. Real terrorism, not fake terrorism like Hans Gruber. Unstable people who have been radicalized by specific ideals and are targeting a predetermined race or gender or location. One study that refers to these people as ideological active shooters found that they often have the same troubled profile as non-ideological shooters. Much like how H.H. Holmes was clearly enjoying his serial killing and getting paid for it, these specific spree killers are convinced they are fighting for a cause and lashing out at the world for notoriety. The Pulse nightclub shooter had pledged his allegiance to ISIS and was checking Facebook to see if he was trending. The Christchurch shooter live-streamed his spree because he obviously wanted to be famous, but also claimed he was doing it for anti-immigration ideology similar to fascist leader of the Britain First movement, Oswald Mosley. So for the question of whether these are terrorist events that need to be publicized or the work of troubled individuals lashing out at the world, the answer is often both, meaning that we need to limit the media exposure that would glorify these people while still talking about them in terms of motivation and radicalization. This is why it seems very suspicious when certain people immediately shout about how we absolutely should not give the Christchurch mosque shooter any attention, nor should we look into his manifesto or political background. Like it sure seems like they are using a well-intentioned idea in order to gaslight their followers away from connecting certain dots about how the hateful ideology that they themselves push might be radicalizing unstable people into committing acts of terrorism. But I don't know. Maybe they are actually concerned about saying the names of spree shooters and certainly wouldn't do it under any other circumstance. And speaking of this whole radicalization thing, did you know that courts looked at 141 hours of cable news footage to determine what phrases the media uses to describe spree shooters? And did you know that the term radicalized never came up when that killer was white? Also, the media was far more likely to refer to white killers as lone wolves and heavily feature interviews with his, yes, it's always his, close family and friends. Here's another study that looked at 433 news documents concerning over 200 mass shootings and found that mental illness was more likely to come up if the killer was white. Because, as a lot of you already know from life, the media doesn't talk about white spree shooters as terrorists. They don't ask how they've been radicalized, and instead they label them as disturbed lone gunmen, who we should immediately forget the names and motivations of, which is super weird, considering that there is absolutely a rise in violence by white supremacists right now, despite what the president might plop out of his mouth. And while that's the subject of a whole other and much longer video that will surely be greatly uplifting to all of us, what I'm saying is that the way our society is choosing to discuss each spree shooting is bafflingly designed to make us fight with each other over etiquette while allowing blatant acts of terrorism to slip by. So, who won? How should we be talking about these events? Should we give thoughts and prayers, or not say their names, or debate endlessly about their motivations? The answer is that we should do all three. They are all necessary participants and should be given a trophy. A participation trophy. Like I said at the beginning,